Welcome to Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Ostler. For any of you listeners that are new to our podcast, I wanted to first explain the purpose of this podcast. It's twofold. Number one is to talk about the more complicated talks in Mormonism in a faithful way so more people can make our restored church work in their lives. And number two is to help all of us better minister to those on the fringes, to better understand their road, the unique difficulties they may face, so that we can mourn with them, comfort them, and bear their burdens. I remember being in a church meeting about a year ago, and the leader of that meeting started to talking about the declining activity rates, especially with our young people, and then concluded the fault is all with those stepping away. I had recently come out of a YSA assignment, and I was unsettled with this generalized conclusion. I feel we also need to look inward and how we can better minister to our members. So the fault isn't just with our members that are stepping away, it's partly with our restored church and the need for our restored church, which isn't the perfect church, to become better. Women's issues has become something that's important to me as I understand and listen to stories of why some women in Mormonism find it hard to make it work, why their voices may not be valued, and why some male leaders and other people in the church may be tone deaf, to use a term I picked up. And I felt impressed to have my good friend, Cynthia Winward, with us today to talk about some of these issues. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
We're really glad you're here. Let's start out a little bit about just who you are and how you became passionate about women's issues in the church.
Okay. Well, I live in Provo, Utah right now, and I'm married and I have 3 children. I have a son on a mission and I have 2 teenage daughters. So this subject seems to come up quite a bit now that I have girls who are getting older. So it's something we talk about a lot in our home. I remember when I started becoming sensitive to women's issues. I was at BYU, and my husband and I had gotten engaged, and we went out. This was in the old days when you picked out invitations, wedding invitations out of a book, right? There was no internet. And so we went and picked out our invitations, and they had you fill out the wording and how you wanted everything worded. And I remember feeling very strongly that I wanted my mother's name and his mother's first name, on the wedding invitation. It was kind of the trend back then. But it was little things like that. And then I remember, like, the week after we got married, I went and opened up our bank account, and I opened it up primarily in my name, and he was the co-account holder.
I like that.
And we had our checks printed, and I put my name on the top. And I know that seems really silly, but I think I was just a little bit worried about, once I'm married, then I'm second. And so it was a small thing. It didn't really mean anything. Of course, he has full access to the checking account. But I just remember looking back now going, that's when things started to just kind of turn in my brain about, I want to be my own person and I want to be valued for who I am. So as time went on, I started having great opportunities in the church, started being able to serve in leadership callings. I've been in a stake Young Women's Presidency, and then I was ward Young Women's President. And then a few years ago, the most recent one was I was in a primary presidency in our ward, which is a challenge when you live in Provo and you have 200 children in a ward.
You have 200 children?
Yeah, I think our primary
Wow.
was the size of some wards, but that's Utah County, right? So, yeah, I would say probably serving as Young Women's President in my ward about a decade ago was probably the most rewarding calling I've ever had. I feel like...
Why?
Well, I feel like to be at the crossroads of young women as they're beginning to make adult decisions for the first time in their life, that's a real privilege. To see them start to decide what my choices are going to be, how I want to live, what I expect out of life, what I expect out of the church, what is my testimony going to look like, to be there at those crossroads and just to be a part of those first adult decisions, that's big. To me, it was big. It was a wonderful experience.
Well, speaking of being a Ward Young Women's president, because I think that's sort of where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, where you can really impact people's lives for good. You're not in a administrative calling, perhaps in a different situation, but you're working with the young women directly. Oh. What are some things you feel the best about that you did in that service? Some attributes you have, or some qualities you have, or the way you were able to relate to the women that are some of the things you feel the best about following that calling?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, frivolously, I would say I'm goofy.
Good.
And I'm kind of funny, and I really am just a big kid. And so in that way, it was really fun. I think that's an easy way to develop quick relationships with youth, is if they see that you don't take yourself too seriously and you're willing to have fun and you're willing to do, silly impressions of actors, or dance, the funky chicken with them, or, just do silly things. It's kind of like, okay, she's cool. We can deal with this old lady.
And did sort of being cool and relating to the kids then help you to be able to connect with them when they needed someone to talk to about complicated stuff?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's the beginning of where I started to see women's issues in the church maybe come a little bit more forward for me. I would develop these relationships with these girls, and they would often confide in me and tell me about some really difficult things that were going on in their lives. Some of them involved the law of chastity. Some of them, were just, troubling past, things they had been through. And very often they would tell me these stories, and then I would in turn say to them, oh, sweetheart, are you willing to talk about this with the bishop? Do you feel like this is something you'd like to talk about? And they would look at me like I was crazy, like I had 3 eyeballs. They just stared at me and thought, I just told you, I don't want to go I'm not going to go tell a man, And we had a fabulous bishop, and I would say to them, Bishop so-and-so, he's an okay guy. He'll be very helpful and tender with you. And, but just the fact that they would have the relationship with me, that they felt comfortable telling me some of these really deep and sometimes heartbreaking scenarios, and then I didn't have the ability to do much about it other than listen and support, which is very important. I began to see, maybe it would be okay if this is, one area where women, Elder Oaks has said that women use priesthood authority, right? In a talk a few years ago, he said, we're not very accustomed to speaking about women and priesthood authority. He said, but what other authority could it be? And I loved that talk, and I loved that
talk
line.
Too. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I use that line whenever I need to, talk about, no, actually women do have priesthood authority, and, depending on the calling, right? I think a young women's president, I think a Relief Society president, I definitely believe that they exercise priesthood authority in their callings. And so, that became one thing that I thought, this is interesting. The same thing keeps happening over and over with these young women that tell me these difficult life situations, that it was traumatic for them to, are you willing to go talk to your bishop, to our bishop? Are you, would your mom go with you? Oh, I could never tell my mom, because I just didn't want them to go alone. Mm-hmm. And I was really hesitant to take the place of their parent. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to do anything secretive with them going to see, a bishop that maybe their parent, why wouldn't you tell me? And so, all I could do was encourage and persuade and see, what feels right for you right now. I'll support you in what it is you need. If you want to go talk to the bishop, great. If you don't, maybe it will be okay someday. But it was really painful for them to, to feel like, I already talked about this with you. Can't you help me?
I like that these young women felt safe in opening up to you. I think any of our listeners need to feel like if anybody in our church structure opens up to a leader in any situation, they should feel safe doing that. Mm-hmm. And I think a leader should, even if they're hearing law of chastity type stuff, then they know they're not the bishop. I think we can do just what you said, Cynthia, is just listen.
Right.
And we're not becoming the bishop by just listening. We're not, becoming the judge in Israel. We're just touching someone's cross and understanding the difficult road they're on,
right,
and just listening and helping them. So I think there's great beauty in that, and I would guess that the sisters that reached out to you are better off for it because they have a trusted in their adult life, a trusted adult in their life that's at least they're talking to and is safe. And I think it's fine that individual people decide who that is for them. I think, bishop's the common judge in Israel and kind of needs to work through the repentance process, but I think anybody listening on this podcast needs to feel permission to reach out to any trusted adult in their life to talk to them about things that are going on in their life, because that's just part of that's part of humanity and part of helping everybody.
Right.
Any more thoughts on that issue? Or any more thoughts on just how sometimes women's voices are muted or women's paths are different or more difficult in the church that became more aware to you as you listen to young women?
Well, not maybe specifically about young women, but then as I went on and had served in other leadership callings, I would have lots of good experiences with priesthood leaders, but I would also have some where I felt like my voice wasn't heard. Or if my voice was heard, that it was kind of like a pat on the head, like, oh, okay,
Can you give our listeners some examples of that?
One specific example I can think of is one time I was in a stake youth meeting, and we were talking about where we would go for youth conference that year. And we had discussed maybe going to kind of a rural location. And as a woman, I brought up, okay, well, you realize that a lot of our young women leaders, if the goal is to get as many leaders to come as possible, a lot of our young women leaders, we have a young stake, they have young children at home, they probably can't go 200 miles, 250 miles away for a youth conference. So, you might want to consider that. And then it was also kind of a rough it kind of youth conference location they were proposing, and I was brave enough to say, is there adequate plumbing? Some of these girls might be on their period and they might not really want to go.
Did you say the word period out loud in a stake meeting?
I did. I looked around. I distinctly remember saying, we're all married here, right? All the men are married.
Well done.
And I just said, if you want to consider hygiene issues for girls, I'm just letting you know this is an issue. I'm not saying there's not a way to solve it. I'm just letting you know
so appropriate
that this is one more thing that needs to be talked about. And I remember at the end of that meeting, basically they just, the person in charge said, well, I've already been thinking about this and I've decided this is where we're going to go. And I, I'm kind of a brave girl. I raised my hand and I said, well, do you mind if I asked why we just spent 2 hours talking about this when you had already made up your mind? And this is one of these situations where I had to put it on the shelf. I know we talk about that a lot of times, put it on the back burner when something doesn't make sense. But I just remember kind of getting a quick little lecture on this is how the priesthood works. Mm. And I sat there and it was kind of like this out-of-body experience. I thought, I've heard about these situations before. And here I am experiencing it for the first time. And I turned next to my friend who was in the meeting with me, and I said, say something. And I looked at her, and her head was hung, and tears were streaming down her cheek. And she whispered to me, and she said, it won't do any good.
Wow. So
she had already given up. I'm feisty, so I was just kind of sitting there going, why did we just do this whole thing? And that was something that, I can see that our leaders are imperfect. And maybe he regretted how that meeting went. I don't know. But that was, another instance where I thought, okay, I don't really know what to make of this. I'm going to put it on the shelf.
Talk about that line, this is how the priesthood works. What do you think he was saying, and how did that make you feel?
I think he meant I hold the ace of spades. So when I put down the ace of spades, then that's the end of it. Thank you for your input, but I have the final decision, and this is my decision. And I thought, what do I say to that?
So I think that's a very helpful story that, I as a male leader, it's helpful for me to hear that, and hopefully for all of our listeners, because I think it's a good example of just where we can do better. I think we also need to validate, did you feel it was okay to feel the way you felt, or did you feel that because you felt the way you felt that you were not faithful?
Oh, no, I didn't think at all that I was the one at fault.
Good.
I really felt like a counsel is a counsel, and we're supposed to be counseling and come to a decision together. So no, I didn't even think, maybe I overstepped my authority, and my calling here. I just felt like my opinion is valid and my question is valid, and please don't talk down to me.
Yeah. And I like the way you realized you didn't cross any line there, and I think it's important and you would know this better than me, for all women to feel that way, that if they feel unsettled at a meeting, not to inwardly reflect that, well, there's something wrong with me, or am I not faithful enough because I'm unsettled. I think we need to give permission, if women feel unsettled in a meeting, to feel that way and
Right.
to validate how they feel, and not sort of infer that the load is with them they shouldn't feel that way. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting that you say, we don't want women to feel this way, or I forget the wording you just used, but I have actually felt that scrutiny or judgment when I have tried to talk about women's issues in the church. It's kind of hurtful when, people will come out and say to me, that's how the world works. And I thought, how dare you? What you're saying to me is you're not being faithful, and I hate that I have to pull out my credentials, but I do if I have to. I'll say, I am a covenant-keeping woman. I have given everything to this church. Please don't question my what's the word?
Commitment to the church.
My commitment to the church. I'm in this, so just because I see things differently doesn't mean that I'm in trouble. Doesn't mean that it's less valid. Doesn't make it less important.
I very much agree with that. Other examples where you felt your voice was marginalized, or you left feeling funny that you want to share, that come to mind?
Well, here's maybe something that I don't know if it goes exactly along with what you're asking. But one thing that we do culturally in the church quite a bit is we refer to men as the priesthood. And that's always been something that's kind of made me wince a little bit. I just thought, why are we doing this? I'm trying to teach my daughters that priesthood is not gendered. And yet we refer to an entire gender by the word priesthood. And I remember, it's been, probably close to 15 years, maybe not quite that long, where President Oaks, he gave a talk, and I can't remember the name of it, but he talked about how we refer to men, and how he used the word erroneously. He said we erroneously refer to men as the priesthood. Men are not the priesthood. And I just remember, hearing that in conference, and I'm doing high fives and woohoo, and everything is going to change now after this. And finally, people won't think, gosh, Cynthia, why are you so sensitive? And so I remember within a couple years of that talk, I was teaching my laurels, and I said, Elder Oaks has said this is erroneous, meaning this is an error. We really shouldn't refer to men as the priesthood. The priesthood is for all of us. The priesthood is the power of God. And I remember one of my sweet young women, she raised her hand and very genuinely said to me, well, then, Sister Winward, what do we call them? I mean, she was serious. She wasn't like, wow. If we don't call them the priesthood, what do we call them? And I just thought that was so interesting that we had done it, that had become such a part of our habit, such a part of our culture, that she wasn't even sure what we called the men. And I just said, well, how about brothers? We are the sisters, they are the brothers, or we are the women, they are the men. I said, I think it's kind of that simple. What do you think? And it was kind of like, oh, yeah. I mean, if you really want to, you can refer to them as priesthood holders, but that's just a mouthful to me. I would rather just say the sisters and the brothers. It's very difficult, I think, sometimes to change that culture and to try to get people to understand. Once again, this is something that's important to me. Maybe it's not important to you, but it's important. Even if it's just to me, it's important.
I like those examples. I love the way you teach about the priesthood is the power of God. That is what it is, and that separates it from, man. It's God power delegated.
Mm-hmm.
Have there been any situations where you've opened up to a priesthood leader about some of your feelings, and he has done a good job of validating how you feel?
That's a good question. I often feel validated, actually. I have talked about some of these issues with my priesthood leaders, and, some have apologized and said, I'm so sorry. I'll handle that type of situation differently from now on.
How did it make you feel to have someone apologize?
I felt like I'm not crazy.
That's cool.
I felt like I was being honored. My pain was being honored and validated. At the same time, I've also tried to explain to other leaders, this decision hurt me. I know you did your best, but this decision hurt me. And to have him look at me and say, I feel good about what I did. And I thought, okay, we're not going to go there, are we?
Have these the good experience you've had come one-on-one, or have they been in more group settings? And I guess what the question is for any women listening that feel they do want to talk is your advice for them to bring these things up one-on-one or more in group settings?
I think both. I think when we have lessons in Relief Society and we talk about the priesthood, this happened not too long ago in my ward, and everyone was raising their hand and making these great comments about their husbands and their sons, and I'm just kind of sitting there going, priesthood isn't a person, let's talk about the power of God instead. And so, I would raise my hand and I would make the same comment that I made to you about this is erroneous. This is an error. We can't do this. We need to do a little bit better. So, but I realize that's easier for me. I'm not shy. I'm extroverted and I'm a little feisty, so I don't mind raising my hand and saying, well, here's a different way to look at it. I realize for some people that's actually really painful to maybe raise their hand and say something like that. I think as Mormons, we often mistake conflict for contention. We say contention is of the devil, but conflict is okay. Conflict just means you feel one way about it and I feel a different way about it. We have a conflicting opinion. I try to be careful and not be contentious. Nobody wants their Sabbath day ruined by, some crazy woman telling them, you're doing this wrong. I try to be sensitive to that. So I think it's great to talk about it in public settings like Relief Society or, in Sunday school classes. By the same token, I've also made appointments with my priesthood leaders. And I say, I have some of these things I'd like to talk about with you. And I've always felt heard. I don't feel like we agree on a lot of things. And, who doesn't want everything to go their way, right? We all just want someone to look at us and say, hot diggity, you're right. Let's completely change the way we do things. That doesn't happen, of course, but I do feel like I have been validated, even when sometimes I go home and I think, dang it, that's not going to change, is it? And that's okay too, but it's frustrating. It's just part of the process, I think, of communicating and trying to help others understand. This is my point of view. Do you want to hear it? Great, let's talk about it.
There's a lot of beautiful things you just said, Cynthia. I love this idea of the apology and how that helps with pain and just acknowledging pain through an apology and saying, I can do better. Now, I think you're not saying every leader should apologize for every situation, because there's some leaders, like you rightly said, do feel whatever was done was the right thing done, but I think they can still acknowledge your pain. I love this idea that we have this phrase in the church, one heart and one mind, and sometimes that gets weaponized in the sense that we're all supposed to feel the same. And I like the way you talk about conflict, what can be healthy. And I've always thought that one heart and one mind means we all just have a desire to come unto Christ. It doesn't mean we're all uniform in our thinking. And in fact, to come unto Christ, it's helpful to have different points of view and validate those different points of view. So I think there's some wonderful things you just taught in that last segment. And then it comes back to this general, this is too strong of a word, but we weaponize things sometimes to get our way.
Yeah.
That would be unrighteous dominion. And you've used a few terms, to describe that. But I think we have to be really careful to not weaponize things to shut people down. I remember, and I've shared on the earlier podcasts about the difficulty I had with the policy statements.
Right.
They just brought pain into my life, and I was just so deeply hurt. Not that any direct people in my life were impacted, but I just somehow felt very uncomfortable about the policy statements. And it was the first time in my life that I sort of was on the other side of the table, so to speak, in the weak category, or in the not feeling completely good about something our leader said. And then all these examples that we have used in the past to sort of talk about people like me now that were uncomfortable with something, the parable of the tares, and not being able to follow the prophet. And it took me a long time before I just could validate the way I felt without feeling wrong about it. So it was helpful for me, but it took a long time for me to give permission for me to be uncomfortable about something and not just think I was weak. And just how could I not own how I felt? And how could we not own how everybody else feels? So it was a paradigm shifting thing for me that allowed me to better, and I'm not really claimed to be any expert at it, of hearing women's voices and at least being willing to listen and realize that I need to honor how everybody feels, because that just seems like something that is part of my baptism covenants and part of something we do. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's interesting you say that, when the policy first came out that you were uncomfortable and you were trying to analyze your feelings, and how did you say it, for the first time you felt like you were on the other side.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that never occurred to me either until I felt like I was on the other side, till I felt like I was in the margins. I feel like my whole life I've been, for lack of a better phrase, very mainstream LDS, right? I went to BYU and I got married and we have our wonderful children, and, I'm a stay-at-home mom. Even, I just feel like, I'm pretty mainstream, LDS Mormon woman. But then we all have things that happen in our life, right? Where all of a sudden we're going, I don't feel like I belong now. What's happened here? This is really painful. Do I belong? Do these teachings apply to me anymore? I feel marginalized. And I felt like for me, a big shift came in my faith and in my practice and in my my ability to mourn with others. Once I found myself in this place of mourning, all of a sudden I feel like the blinders came off. And even though I don't know what it's like to be marginalized in a myriad of different ways, I knew what it felt like for me to be marginalized, to be in pain. And I feel like that's made me, it's helped me to open my eyes more and see others, our LGBT brothers and sisters. And I don't know what that struggle would be like. I have no idea. But I do know what it's like to feel alone and sad. And is there anything I can do to reach out? How can I be an ally? How can I let them know I'm a safe person?
That's really beautiful. I think that's great for our listeners just to understand, and especially those that perhaps haven't felt, I call it sometimes church-generated pain. I think we need to honor church-generated pain in all churches. I don't think our restored church or any church is capable of being perfect all the time, and I think we need to acknowledge that of all the pain we feel in the world, 1% of that can come from our own church.
Sure.
And the other pain we feel, we're good at turning to our church and sometimes having that healed. Our church community is very good at healing pain. But sometimes when it's church-generated pain or feeling marginalized because of point of view or a leader that's kind of pulled out the heavy-handed card, then how do you then turn to the church to heal you? And then it's more complicated. And I think that's why some people step away, because the pain they feel is not being healed at church. And so they find that they don't have a way to, it's sometimes even more emotionally healthy for them to step away for a period of time.
Absolutely.
And I think that's something we need to acknowledge. And I do think our restored church should be framed as the perfect church. And if it's not the perfect church, it is capable of making mistakes. And
right.
I think we both love Elder Uchtdorf for the talk he gave, where we frankly have made mistakes. And
definitely.
And I think so many of our members are looking for an authentic view on our beautiful restored church that is doing the best it can, but at times, falls short. And at times we need to look inward and think how we can do better to meet. I always thought theology, and this is a talk I read, should start, and our culture should start, not for the most privileged people that fit in the center of Mormonism, whatever that is.
Yeah.
I sort of feel like that growing up as a fourth-generation white, male, straight. I sort of have all these return missionary. I have all these boxes checked.
Yeah.
6 kids, lots of BYU blood in us, and
yeah.
And I always think the culture of theology shouldn't start with me that sort of fits in the bullseye, but should start with those that are on the furthest on the margins, whatever that is.
I love that.
LGBTQ, and because I look at the framework for that as what Christ did in his own ministry, and he didn't seem to go to the most privileged. I don't think if I lived in Christ's day,
right, he
would have been hanging out with me. I don't think he would have saw that I needed that very much. Even if I was a really good guy, I hope I would be back then. And I think he would have thought, well, he's okay. I'm going to go hang out with all these other people that really need my doctrine and my love. Any thoughts on that?
The one, right? We leave the 99 to help the one. Yeah, I like that you said you checked off all the boxes, or it would appear so, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure you have your own pain too. Everyone has something or some things, but yeah, I feel like I've lived this very mainstream check off the boxes life, and nobody goes looking for pain. Nobody goes looking for heartache. Nobody looks for nobody looks for trials. That's for sure. I don't think anyway. But when they come, how are we going to handle them? And I don't want to be a Pollyanna where I say, I'm so glad I've been through some of the painful things because now I can minister to others. And, I don't want to say that because it's a brutal process to feel that amount of pain and to have to, in many ways, put your faith back together. You have this puzzle, and I felt like, there was a time in my life where the pieces weren't fitting anymore and things were breaking apart. And I've done my very best to put that puzzle back together, but some of the pieces don't fit anymore. And I've just had to be patient and say, maybe they'll fit again someday. Maybe they won't. But if I keep my eye on the Savior, I think I'll be okay. I don't have to worry as much.
I love that. And I love the acknowledgement that you've had a faith journey that's occurring within this whole framework, which a lot of our listeners have. I've had the same thing, and most of the people I know that are working through their faith want to find a way to authentically stay in. I think we look at sometimes, and you don't, but we look at people that are working on their faith and assume that they want to step away and assume that they're sinning or not reading their scriptures or not praying. But I find that to be potentially damaging to them as they're working forward in the best way they know how to authentically stay in. And I love your puzzle analogy, Cynthia, and I love the way the pieces don't quite all fit back together again, but faithfully you're trying to move forward, and I love that. And I think that example is helpful to our listeners to find a way to stay. I call it fallen dominoes. I have a few dominoes that have fallen.
Yeah. Puzzles, dominoes. We like games.
We do like games,
Yeah.
but I've learned that not all my dominoes have fallen, and there's some dominoes or puzzle pieces that are really holding firm and are part of the reason I stay. And I think sometimes it's helpful to see your example and others' examples of people because I think most of our members do go through a challenging period. And right now there's more of that than there has been at any time I'm aware of the church. I'm also aware that your personality is wonderful and unique in the sense you're willing to talk about how you feel. But I also go to your Relief Society and our young women's, and I obviously our men's group too, and how many are quietly suffering and quietly muted and quietly looking for an authentic conversation or a way to express how they feel. And you're kind of wired to be able to take this on, and I think that's beautiful, but there's certainly a large percent of our members that can't. And so I think as leaders and as members, we need to recognize there's a lot of quiet feelings in our congregations that are silently hurting, and we need to think of a way to create congregations where people can share how they feel, and because I think that can be incredibly healing. Any thoughts on that?
You know, that was kind of an epiphany for me recently, was thinking about my personality has allowed me, I think, to navigate my road in Mormonism. Maybe it's been a little bit easier road for me than maybe someone who is very introverted, shy, someone who suffers from anxiety. You know, sometimes being at church is so anxious for them that it really isn't a choice for them to be at church. You know, if it's more pain, you know, literally physically painful for them and breathing, and, you know, they have these, anxiety attacks, it's not really my place to judge, is it? If they can't be there, and some of these issues, you know, and I've had friends where they feel so marginalized as women that they've decided, I have to step away, and maybe I'll come back, but maybe I won't. And I'm so embarrassed to say that, you know, years ago I would be like, oh, come on, you can do this, you know, be a tough girl. You can do it. And now I realize that is not my place. That is absolutely not my place. My place is to listen and validate and say, what can I do? How can I help you on this journey, whatever that journey is?
Do you have a lot of people that open up to you with these type of conversations and feelings, how they feel?
I do. I think because I'm willing to be vulnerable and raise my hand and make these comments that show my life is not perfect. And I've even said that in comments. You know, I would love for all of you to think that I have it all put together, but I don't. And, you know, and then I'll go on to make my comment, and I always get a text message after church that night. Someone will bring me a plate of cookies, and they'll just say, thank you so much. You said exactly what I needed to say. I remember one time a sister said that to me, and I have never heard her make a comment in Relief Society ever. We've been in the same ward for years. And I said to her, you just need to speak up more. If you agree, the more of us that speak up, the more, you know, validation and understanding and concern and love will take place. And she just said, I could never do that.
Yeah.
And she meant it.
Yeah.
She wasn't just being modest. She was like, oh no, I cannot do that.
Yeah.
That was eye-opening.
And so I think that's really helpful for us to realize how many people may not be speaking up, and that it's very difficult. I find in my own ward, even though I'm pretty open in social media and podcasts, it's a different dynamic, even my own ward, to sort of open up at times about how I feel.
Yeah.
And it's kind of puzzling to me and I love my ward, it's a great ward. But it is interesting, that dynamic back in a home ward, and that even it's sometimes hard for me to open up and do what you do.
Well, nobody wants to be misunderstood, right?
Yeah, there's great risk.
Yeah, there is. It's really risky. Nobody wants to be misunderstood. I've just decided that's one of the worst things, is to pour your heart out and have someone judge you or come to a conclusion that you really didn't want them to come to. That's painful.
Cynthia, I tweeted out, I'm on Twitter, because my high school kids got me on Twitter. I didn't really know I'd get on Twitter. I'm kind of an old guy.
Yeah.
But I said we would be talking about women's issues, and a few questions came through. I just said, tell me what we should talk about. So here's one that came in, Cynthia, from Twitter, and this is from Andrew. he asked modesty, and it's often women are asked to sort of keep men in line, and they're encouraged to dress modestly to prevent the boys from messing up. It's like the boys can't control themselves, so it's the girl's job. Any thoughts on that, especially from a young women's leader and a mother of daughters?
I would love to teach a lesson on modesty and never mention clothing. I think modesty, I should have a modest attitude. I should live within my means, right? I should have a modest home. We shouldn't be boastful. To me, that's modest. And it makes me sad for our young men that we would degrade them and take away their power by saying, the girls have to do this because you are incapable of doing this. Girls have to dress a certain way because you can't control your thoughts. How harmful is that to our young men? And how harmful is that to our young women to put that kind of burden on them? It is my job to get up in the morning and dress myself. And it is, a young man or, men, it is their job to wake up and decide, this is how I'm going to conduct my life. It is not my job to control their thoughts. And I've taught that to my girls, and I taught that to my young women, that you are in charge of you and they are in charge of them. And let's not degrade our boys, and let's not put undue pressure on our girls.
I love your broader definition of modesty, and I love the way we can look at that in a more healthy way. Cynthia, here's another question from Twitter from Megs. Megs writes, I'm in a mixed faith marriage and have no children. I was recently told that the reason I feel anxious and out of place at church is because I don't have a family. It sounds like a mixed faith marriage, meaning she's active and her husband is not active. And she feels out of place at church because she's coming alone, is what I'm reading here. That just made me feel more out of place to hear that. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think this goes back to what we were talking about the one. If we're making anyone at church feel that they are less than, that their relationships are less than, that they haven't met some kind of standard, then we have a problem in our culture, and we need to ask them, what is it you need? What would you teach us about this? Tell us about your amazing husband. Tell us, what are his strengths? What are his, I think we just need to find that common ground that we have with everyone, with all of God's children. I don't see my husband who's active in the church as better than a friend of mine whose husband isn't. They just have different experiences, they've made different choices. Doesn't mean one is better than the other, I don't think.
I love your answer there, and I love the idea of getting to know Meg's husband. It sounds like he's not coming to church and know his name and what gifts he has and who he is, and getting to know him as a fellow human versus having a definition of just someone that doesn't come to church, whether he's not a member of the church or a less active member. Megs follows up with another tweet, I think a good one. Maybe you can chime in on this one, Cynthia. She writes, in my youth, I felt marginalized by not being able to do the same type of activities as the young men, such as high adventure. And I think she's talking about here that there seems to be, often I hear this a lot, more focus on the young men from a funding standpoint, from a sort of the amount of time at Word Council we might talk about young men, the amount of time they may be speaking in church, the amount of time we just focus on the young men compared to the young women. I think Meg is writing here how she felt marginalized as a young woman compared, and seeing just how we perhaps place more value on the young men's program. Thoughts on that one?
Well, first of all, I would say she's not alone. And I think because it's maybe not okay, or we've kind of labeled those questions as not okay to talk about, that it's unfortunate that so many of our young women feel alone, that they feel like, I don't belong, I feel marginalized, why am I the only one who feels this way? And she's not the only one. There are so many. And I think the most important thing is to validate validate, ask, tell me why you feel this way and help me understand. And what do you think we could do better? And, I have been, I've been able to talk about this very issue with my leaders. I studied finance in college, and so I feel like that's why I always get put over the budget when I'm in a presidency. It doesn't matter, if it says the president should be the one to manage the budget, but it's always me. And so I remember when I was in a primary presidency, and I went to our bishop and I said, I would like the girls to be able to do day camp like the boys. I would like them to have a blue and gold dinner. Can we call it the pink and silver dinner? I mean, it's silly things, but, and then I broke down our costs. This is what I would need to make this happen. And he was like, go for it. Let's do it.
Wow, that's good. And I know that sometimes some women, I think it's something that men and women feel at times, that there is more focus on young men. And we love our young men. And I have 4 young men and 2 young women. I love them both growing up. But I think male leadership may be more wired to be thinking about the young men as preparing for missions, and there may be more of a lockstep path for them preparing for a mission, and so there may just be more mental energy focused on getting young men to this doorway of a mission, and why that's not a requirement for women. So I think, but many women end up serving, and so I've always been sensitive to the fact that we perhaps do focus more on our young men at that level, and I think local leaders are starting to recognize that and do better. And I see things in my own congregation where I feel like young women's voices are equally valued in our congregation. This week we had the 5 or 6 beehives in our ward take the entire sacrament meeting and speak, and then the concluding speaker was the beehive leader who has a doctorate of chemistry and talked about that. And I thought that was a great lesson, not only for the young women, but for the young men. I love that the young men in our ward listened to, her name is Michelle, talk about her graduate degree, and as a way to help our young men have a role model of a wonderful, strong, capable woman that has obviously is a wonderful mother and a wonderful beehive leader, but a wonderfully educated person. So what would you say that we're just all being too sensitive about all this stuff?
I don't think we can be too sensitive to others. If it's important to them, then it's important. And I have something to learn from somebody else, things that are important to them, things that are painful for them, things that they're passionate about, that they're excited about.
I love what you said. If it's important to them, it's important.
It is important.
And I love that power of that statement. So I don't think we're being too sensitive. If it's important to somebody, and our goal is to have everybody come unto Christ, how are we going to help them come unto Christ if we can't be sensitive to what's important to them? I sometimes think of the congregation, Cynthia, that we have 2 ways to sort of connect people with Mormonism. We could accept them into the congregation once they just feel like everybody else and somehow have them do all that before they become active. And so all of the people that aren't active are somehow we have a way to get them just to feel like everybody else, and then they come to the congregation where
nobody would come.
Or we could say, come as you are, feel how you are, bring all your experiences, bring the difficult things you have about Mormonism, come, because I've always felt in our YSA ward that I'm more likely to get people to the temple, which was always a goal, the covenant path back to God and the temple, and we could talk about that in a second. I'm going to get more people there, and I've always felt that's where the narrowing of the gate really starts, is at the temple. It's not at the congregation.
No.
The congregation should be this incredibly safe place where if it's important to you, it's important. I love how you answered that question. Any thoughts on that concept?
Just that's part of our baptismal covenant. We've talked about that, to mourn with those who mourn. If it's something that causes someone to mourn, I need to put myself in their shoes. I need to know what that feels like.
Continuing on with these questions, Cynthia, one of the things that I realize that some women are uncomfortable with some of the language in the temple. Will you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think depending on the the life circumstances of the woman, there can be a lot painful. I remember my children are all adopted. And when my husband and I, we were, in our early 20s, that's really young to find out, you're never going to have biological children. And I remember just being in the temple, and for the first time ever, some of the wording about multiply and replenish and about, families and posterity. And I thought, and I'm embarrassed to say this now, but it was very real to me as a young woman. I thought, what is my purpose then?
Wow.
If I can't fulfill my covenant, what is my purpose? What am I going to do now? And so I can always go back to, that we talked about being marginalized, right? I felt marginalized then. I wasn't sure how to sort through that. And, it took me some time to just kind of realize, these are eternal covenants. Not all of this is going to happen today or tomorrow. And I want to say that made everything okay. It doesn't. And, there are still certain words that I kind of wince at that kind of make me go.
What words? I think it's okay just to share a word or two that are hard.
I think one that is really common for women to not like is the word hearken. I think, I'm fine if I need to listen to my husband, if that's something I need to promise to do, but I think he should do the same. So to me, some things feel a little bit unequal that way. I think...
Any other examples of things that feel unequal to you or other women that you've talked to?
I think the fact that men covenant with God and I covenant with my husband, who then covenants with God, I find that, it kind of makes me... if you picture, I want to put my hands on my hips and go, hey, wait a minute. It just feels a little bit unequal to me. I don't have an answer to that one. The only...
Have you ever shared with a priesthood leader that you're uncomfortable with that?
I have.
And what was the reaction from the priesthood leader?
He didn't have, I don't remember exactly.
It was positive or negative or just...
Well, I just remember, he validated...
Okay.
What I was saying, about hearken. But at the same time, I don't know how much could he have said. What would you say?
Yeah.
What did you say if a woman has ever
I
said
hope
that
I
to
would
you?
say, after trying to listen to a lot more women, I hope I would validate. And I would say, you have a right to feel that way. And if you're uncomfortable, if you're uncomfortable with the word hearken, be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
If you're uncomfortable covenanting through your husband with God, and the proclamation of the family has you really covenanting directly with God as a co-partner, then be uncomfortable with that. That would probably what I would say today, I think.
I love it.
And I think that doesn't mean I'm driving a wedge any further between you and the church. If there's some wedges there, I think we drive wedges further by not validating and not letting people feel how they feel. But I think if we validate and say, it's okay you feel that way. Talk about, on another subject, I know that men have a lot of chances to serve in leadership, and there's a high council and a stake presidency, and there's probably, I haven't done the numbers, but there's just more ways, leadership assignments for men than women. Talk
Right.
about how sometimes that can send a message to women that might be difficult.
Well, I think it's interesting that some... I didn't notice so much the disparity between, how many men can serve in leadership callings versus women until I got older, maybe even until I was in leadership. It just wasn't on my radar. I think it's really interesting now that our young women are noticing, and maybe I was just an oblivious kid, but I talk with my daughters, I talk with other young women, and as I was a young women's leader, they notice these things that, a 12-year-old boy gets ordained to the priesthood. What's the equivalent for me? And I say to them, I don't know. There isn't. And the only thing I've been able, at least, I tell my daughters in my home is, God lets you choose how you're going to serve. He doesn't give you such a specific list of what you do. That doesn't make it okay. that doesn't make their, I'm still trying to validate. This is a very real concern, absolutely. But at the same time, try to help them. This is what you can do in your personal ministry. You get on your knees. You find out, what
That's
it is,
cool.
what it is that you can do. But as we've talked tonight, I've told you about these different experiences serving. Those are the things that I kept putting on the shelf. That's a phrase we like to use.
Yes.
I think with people that have faith challenges, put it on the shelf or put it on the back burner. And I felt like that shelf eventually broke, or I said the puzzle blew up and I wasn't sure how to put it back together. And for me personally, and this is just me, I've kind of come to the conclusion that as long as we have 50% of the church making decisions on behalf of the 100%, we're never going to be 100%. That's just my opinion. I know plenty of women who are like, I don't want to be in charge. I don't want to have a leadership. And of course, I would rather sit on the couch too and eat a bag of Doritos. I'm not saying, put me in charge. What I am saying is I think women have more to offer. I think there are more ways that we can lead. There are more ways that we can affect change. I think, we teach in the church that gender is eternal. Well, if gender is eternal, then that means the difference between you and the difference between me, those differences are needed. And my experiences and talents need to be part of the equation, not just male experiences and talents. And I really believe that we'll get there. What that looks like, that's not for me to say. But I really do feel like that there is more for women to do. There is more that we want to do. We want to do more. We want to serve more. We want to lead more. And I hope for change. One of the things I love about being Mormon is that we believe this is a living church, right? We believe all that God has revealed, does now reveal, and will yet reveal. And I believe there is more to be revealed for women.
I love that. And I'm just going to, in conclusion, I'm trying to imagine all the women that are listening to this podcast or the women on social media, and we'll give you a chance to share some thoughts too. I believe in you younger women. I believe so much in who you are and the gifts that you have and your desire to do good things in the world. You're bright, you're capable, you're educated, you're doing incredible things. And some of you, there's a little tension between you and the church right now, especially the younger we go. And I'm recognizing and validating that tension, and I hope you find a way to stay. You are the kind of young women that I hope my single sons will marry. You're bright, you're capable, you're doing good things in your life. You're often dedicated to causes that are outside of sort of the circles of way we normally serve in our church by helping homeless people. I mean, in saying that, you don't have an official church calling to go volunteer at Africa or go serve in a homeless shelter or go read to children in a youth center. And I think you're the future of the world. I do not buy into the narrative the world's getting worse. I do believe Satan is real and wants to destroy people, but I don't. I look at you as a great generation that is going to help our church grow and become the church God wants us to be, and the church that will make it easier for everybody to feel welcome in the church, and the church that will get us from 16 million members to 100 million members. But I believe women are a big part of that future, and I believe we have great women in our church that are doing great things, but I think that the future role of women will increase because we can't become the church God wants us to be without women being more fully valued and used to help grow the kingdom. And I recognize that many of our listeners are fine with where the church is for women. I'm not advocating for any doctrinal changes, but I just trust our leaders that things will change and improve, and they're not quite where they need to be. There's more chapters that need to be written, and so that you can fully sort of let your wings fly within the organization of the church to not only accomplish your own life mission, but to help bring others to Christ, men and women. I love strong women involved in my son's lives. I married a strong woman. She's bright, she's capable. I never could become the man I am without her, but it's not necessarily about me becoming the man. It's partly about us as parents becoming the parents we need to be and the children of God, because we have each other. So she doesn't exist just to help me sort of become a priesthood leader and the man. We equally exist to help each of us become the people that God wants us to be and provide the example for our children. So I have hope in the future, but I'm so grateful for Cynthia to come and just share. You're a good friend. We've been connected on social media. We went to a group lunch together, but your voice and where you are is the future of our church. And I would guess that young women have loved having you as their young women's president. You are just perfectly designed to be a young women's leader. God created you from the pre-earth life to be, a wonderful young women's leader. And I just imagine that there are young women that only you connected with in a unique and authentic way that was so helpful for them to be able to say, well, I'm staying in the church. I've got someone like Cynthia. She's a little outspoken. She's, whatever beautiful attributes you have, give them an example of someone that they can follow and stay in. And then I look at you younger millennial members that are going to be the future leaders. I have grandchildren that are being raised. They're young. And I have a wonderful daughter that's raising wonderful grandchildren along with her husband, and she's the future of the world and the church. But you all younger LDS women are going to be the people that are going to be raising my grandchildren, and you will help them and increase their vision. So I'm confident in the future of our church because I'm confident in our women and who they are and their gifts, and those gifts being more fully valued. And in closing, Cynthia, there's a question from Twitter from Cindy. And she says, how can we support each other in the moment and make sure we're hearing each other?
I think to support each other in the moment means to honor where that person is at in that very moment, in the church, out of the church, on the fringes, in the margins, honoring their path, honoring how they believe. I think we need to keep an eternal perspective, but at the same time, we still have to get through today. Eternity is a long way away. I don't have a clue, necessarily what eternity is going to be like, but I can reach out today and help someone today and honor her path where she's at. It doesn't cost me anything, right? I think we're so worried about if I honor where this person is at, I could be condoning something I don't believe in. Well, how can that be? We're not the judge anyway. Christ is our advocate. He is the one who will judge us. That's not my job. My job is to be a gatherer, not a sifter. So how can I gather if at the same time I'm trying to sift out people that I think, well, you don't belong?
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for joining us for this podcast. I love your concluding thought on your answer to in the moment. What a wonderful phrase. And just to be with someone in their moment and honor where they are. I love your answer there.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of our listeners, for joining us for another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.